Так, шановні колеги, починаємо наш вебінар. Дякуємо, що приєдналися. Сьогодні ми будемо говорити про прогнози розвитку ТМТ-індустрії в світі і яким чином ці прогнози знайдуть своє відображення в Україні. Як зазначалося, прогнози будуть англійською мовою. Ми не будемо перекладати, тому я зараз перейду на англійську і будемо починати. So, I welcome all of you. As a tradition, in spring, we are now presenting the Global TMT Predictions Deloitte for the year 2021. My name is Volodimir Юмашев. I'm a partner at Deloitte, and I am leading TMT industry group at Deloitte Ukraine. And I will be moderating this event. I would like to welcome Pol Lі. Pol Lí is the head of Deloitte Research, partner, author of the Global TMT Predictions report, author of numerous articles and several books. Pol will talk about several predictions right now. Then everybody will have a chance to ask questions to Pol. Questions could be asked via online chat in a Q&A, and we will try to respond to as much questions as we can during the presentation. So, thank you very much for joining, and Pol, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, and it's a pleasure to be here in Kiev, although not really in Kiev, but certainly spiritually in Kiev. And thank you all for making the time to join this session today. As Vladimir mentioned, I'll be talking about 8 of the predictions that we have for this year. And the way we're structuring this is that I will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. And then I will talk to 4 more of the predictions, and then we'll have Q&A after that. So there'll be 2 opportunities for Q&A. And as Vladimir mentioned, please feel free to send through the questions in any language via the chat or via Q&A, and we'll be very happy to address any of the questions that you have. So what I will do now is share my screen, and we will start off with the first part of the presentation. So the first topic I want to talk around is in the area of media and around sports. But unusually, I want to talk about the women's sports market. And the reason for that is largely because it's likely to be a very good commercial opportunity to be involved in women's sports. And what I want to show you is some data points around women's sports. So one of them is that most sports fans, which is most people, are interested in at least one women's sport. And you can see the interest in women's sports by several key metrics. So with elite sports, one of the key metrics is attendance at venues. And in 2019, the numbers were really, really good in that there were a growing number of fixtures which were attracting tens of thousands of paying fans. So the numbers were not quite at the level of the men's game, but they weren't far off. So, for example, one example here I've got is for cricket. And one of the last matches played in Australia before lockdown had almost 90,000 attendees to watch one cricket match. And in terms of football in Europe, some of the bigger teams which have set up their own sort of women's clubs, like Barcelona Football Club, Atletico de Madrid, also Liverpool and Everton and Tottenham and Arsenal, they were getting 30 to 40,000 people watching women's football. So really significant. And another massive pillar of monetization is television. And again, there were really good numbers being achieved. So if we look at the final for the Women's World Cup, there were 260 million viewers. And that number matters more and more because it's really hard to get big audiences when you've got subscription video on demand. And for the matches for the England games in the UK, those matches were the most watched television of any type during that year. But in terms of the value for money, what's really interesting is, despite the fact that there is so much interest in women's sports, monetization is very poor. And the contrast is, so if you look at all sports, then in 2018, so pre-pandemic, the value of that was estimated at $481 billion. Now, the value of women's sports that year or this year is under $100 million. So it is way, way lower. Now, what I'd expect is that there will be a virtuous circle of growing audiences, sponsorship revenue, and TV rights. And as each one of them rises, that's likely to be accompanied by a rise in other elements. So as, for example, attendance rises, that drives TV drives attendances, exposure, or the ability to have large audiences drives sponsorship. So all of those work together. Now, the great thing is at the moment, it's really good value to be involved in women's sports. So the TV rights are way cheaper. So you look at basketball, they're 1/100th of the price of the men's game. For football in the UK, it's 1/200th. And for football in Spain, it's 1/300th. And also, I think it's a great time to be involved as a sponsor because the rights are so much cheaper at the moment. So just looking at the next topic, so staying on the subject of sports, one of the themes that we've seen in sports over the last decade is growing professionalization of sports. And one of the elements of that has been more and more quantification of athletes. And if you think about some of the changes that we've been through over the last few decades, so even measuring steps 20 years ago was something that only professional athletes did. And now that's a capability in every smartphone. And what we've seen is that the ability to measure sports performance has grown and grown. And there's been a constant trickling down of that capability to more and more athletes. So that's the trend that we've seen. So when you look at what can be measured right now, and if you think about the fact that pedometers and measuring steps 10 years ago were still quite new, and something like the Fitbit only came out in 2009, and now it's utterly commoditized. So what can happen with professional athletes is you can measure every element. So you can measure the entire body, the arms and the feet. You can measure the head. And in that regard, one of the questions is, if you're starting to measure, for example, the forces applied when playing football and doing headers, that information could be kept for a long time and be used to understand the impact of headers on the brain. And that kind of understanding is really important for player safety. So in terms of organs, you can measure heart rate. And one of the metrics around heart rate is capturing the gap between running flat out and recovering to resting heartbeat. And that kind of data point is, similar to, for example, an athlete measuring the time it takes to do 100 meters, or the acceleration from 0 to 20 kilometers an hour. All those are important metrics, and they start to become metrics that could be used for betting or for quantifying the performance of an athlete, and more. So this is the kind of analytics that is becoming possible for more and more entities. So this kind of analysis over here, where you can track the flow of an individual, you can measure the distance between players. This is something which professional teams have used for a long time. What is becoming different at the moment is a smartphone can be used to capture some of that data, and the processor in a smartphone gets more powerful by 20 to 30% every single year. And now you can download apps for free to analyze sporting performance. So you've got that trickle-down effect of capabilities developed for the elite teams moving to the lesser teams, but still professional, and moving into the pro amateur leagues. Now, this over here is a image from a video game, and this is a video game for football, American football. So football with a funny shaped ball as opposed to a spherical ball, which is what we're used to in Europe. And one of the outputs that's feeding into this game is each player's performance, their metrics, how they move, can be fed into the game. And so one of the questions is, if you are a player, what are the rights that you want to retain that can be monetized? And we're used to the idea of image rights for players. But this starts moving into physiological rights or biometric rights. So there is more to be monetized. There is more to be measured around here. And also, when you think about a 90-minute game of football, there's probably 5 minutes of really interesting action. So the highlights, and will be some of that. So it could be like a stunning goal or a stunning save. That serves as a video memento, so as a souvenir. And you've probably heard of non-fungible tokens, or NFTs. And so one other output from all of this is, so a player's movements can be converted into a video game. They can be used to assess performance. They can be used for betting. But for example, a basketball shot, like a dunk, can become something which, when applied to the blockchain, becomes unique. So NBA Top Shot is the sale of video clips of basketball play, the best bits. And they may be 10 to 20 seconds long, but historically they have generated almost $500 million worth of sales. So that's something to consider in that space. So also staying on the media space, one of the longer term trends that we're seeing is the migration to the perfect video image. And this is a migration that's taken place across multiple media. So for many years, we've become used to the idea that a smartphone screen is perfect in that there are no visible pixels. And over time, the screen has become brighter so you can see it in any light, and the color range has become more vivid. And you can even do things like Dolby Vision on smartphone screens. So making that capability available for TVs is slightly harder, but that's what's happening. And what we expect for this year is that there'll be about 1 million television sets which are sold, which are in 8K resolution. And 8K is the upgrade to 4K. And it's not just about delivering more pixels, so 33 million pixels versus 8 million pixels for 4K. The standard also describes color range, which is what the brain can recognize probably more easily than pixel density, and also describes the rate at which the frames are changed. So up to 120 frames per second, which is probably the limit of what the human eye can perceive in terms of movement. And also it includes 24 channel sound, so 22 treble and then 2 bass. So cinemas will have that kind of capability, but homes are unlikely to. And another factor that's often accompanying 8K TVs at the moment is perfect brightness. So we're moving to the point where a television can replicate almost any individual scene. So it could be that you could replicate like a summer's day in Hawaii. You could replicate the whiteness of the Antarctica or the darkness of a English summer's day with black clouds. But we're getting close to the point where a screen can fool an individual into thinking that they're completely somewhere else. And as I mentioned again, it's not just televisions, it's also smartphones, it's laptop monitors are away from there, some tablet screens, but also retail displays, outdoor displays, and the backdrops to rock concerts have long been 8K resolution. So we're being trained as consumers to expect better and better resolution. So I'll just get that screen over there. Now, as part of that trajectory, what we're seeing is a growing availability of 4K. And it's this is one of the first years in which the majority of TV sets sold are 4K. And in most markets, 4K is the number 2 standard. In the US, I think the majority of homes now have 4K. And kind of to feed into that and also to differentiate, a lot of the SVOD platforms provide all their latest content in 4K, often created in 8K, but it's offered in 4K. And also the streaming platforms are doing a similar thing. And all this content can be delivered probably over a 15 to 25 megabit per second connection. So a lot of that can be delivered right now. And in anticipation of the move to 8K, one of the things which is happening is content like This Is From the Morning Show from Apple TV Plus is being filmed in 8K and then mastered in 4K, but it will be able to upgrade to 8K when the market, when content is available. And if you think some of the SVOD platforms are creating content which costs perhaps $15 million per episode, so it's a massive, massive budget, but they're creating content which will last for decades. And what I think it also means for the broadcasters is broadcasters don't have enough spectrum to be able to deliver content in this resolution. And the cost of creating 8K content is getting cheaper and cheaper. The first time I saw an 8K camera back in 2012, it was about 80 kilos in weight, and they were prototypes. They created phenomenal pictures, but it just seemed absurd in terms of the cost and the difficulty in using them. And now 8K cameras available as DSLRs or even smartphones, and they are thousands of pounds and sometimes cheaper. So the last thing I want to look at is also staying kind of on the media topic and looking at virtual reality in enterprise and education. So virtual reality within the media market, say for games, is a small market. There's a few million headsets which are there. The virtual reality kits which are based on smartphones within holders seem to have gone away. And so when we look at applications, then one of the applications is looking at headsets in enterprise and education. So also another corollary trend is augmented reality, whereby what you see via the goggles is a mixture of the real world out there with a virtual world added to it, so superimposed to it. So what we're looking to understand is how big is this market? And what we think is that, this is a market that is possibly a few $1 billion in size. When we look at the enterprise and education market, we think it was about $2 billion in 2020, and that considers everything. So the hardware and importantly, the content. And one data point that we regularly see around content is it costs 10 times as much to create content for virtual reality as it does for a 2D screen. And if you consider also, if you're creating content for virtual reality, your addressable market is really, really small. So one thing we're forecasting for 2021 is perhaps 200,000 units of virtual reality headsets. So it's a really tiny market. But one of the things we want to talk about was the fact that, despite the pandemic, despite the fact that we're to a large extent working virtually, the demand for augmented or virtual reality headsets remains really small. So I'll just pause there and wait to see if there are any questions from Vladimir. And I'll just stop sharing for a moment.
Thank you, Paul. Really interesting. Before we see questions in the chat on Q&A, I have a question from myself. You mentioned a couple of trends that are relevant definitely for TMT telecom media technology industry. During the last couple of years, we discussed that TMT predictions are not only for TMT industry anymore. They are for wider audience, for the possibility to apply technologies in some other spheres. The technologies you just mentioned, the 4 trends, like virtual reality, 8K video, and other things. What could be, say, top three things where those technology can be used and maybe change our life?
Yeah. So, okay. So I can certainly talk about whether it can be applied. Whether they will change our lives is sort of like a bigger stretch in terms of the question. But certainly in terms of, virtual reality has the potential to be used a lot more for training, particularly for difficult environments. So where, for example, you're training people in disaster relief, and virtual reality has an application there. For augmented reality, a big application is likely to be in terms of maintenance and the ability to see and to be guided as to where to work on. So it could be that somebody is guided to look at a possible crack on a gas pipeline, and virtual reality helps pinpoint where the problem may be and can also guide on where the fix is. So if I look at the area of screens, then what's really interesting about all those screens is the ability to sort of create very, very powerful visual displays in any environment. And certainly what we expect to see in retail and advertising is a much greater use of screens. And when I look at the media sector, so you're probably used to the idea of a green screen. And for the creation of movies, then having a green screen enables you to add the background in, which is better than not being able to do so. But better still, and this is something which is starting to be used as a technique by companies like Disney for The Mandalorian, is using large screens in the highest resolution possible to provide the backdrop as a replacement for the green screen. So that will become the common practice within a few years. As the panels become cheaper, then it will just make it a lot easier to create content. So if you imagine an actor with a green screen has to guess where to look or what to interact with. But if you have a high resolution panel behind the actor, then everything is in place. There's less guesswork, and there is a lot less post-production to consider as well, particularly if there are lots of reflective surfaces within there. And then in terms of the other predictions, which we'll talk through, then certainly a lot of them are applicable across all vertical sectors.
Cool. There are two questions came in Q&A area. So first question on AR, VR. Is it demand mostly from B2B segment now, or there are still some B2C applications that create demand, continue creating demand?
Yeah, so for the consumer area, then the biggest area of demand for VR is around video games. And there is, sort of just one major, or has two major players which are in that space. So there's Sony, which created a VR headset for the PS4. And I think it's launched a model also for the PS5. So that is the major consumer application which is out there. So for regular education of, let's say, students, then virtual reality is probably less applicable, partly because there are a lot less headsets. But also, if you're a teacher, you want to be able to see, ideally, how the student is reacting. And that's one of the limitations that I find with, this setup over here is you can see me. But an important thing when you're presenting is to be able to see the audience. And to make sure that they can understand, so body language is a very, very useful form of communication. But with any virtual world, that disappears.
Yeah, thanks. And what do you think could be the reason for roadblocks for low demand in B2C sector for VR? Is it price or something else? A major factor is price. But I think even if you were to deal with price, and so for VR to work really well, what you need to have is an 8K screen for each eye, so that you see absolutely no dots. So it's a perfectly smooth image. So that gives you reality. And then you need to have a really high frame rate. And so if you're moving your head around, then as you move around, then the image changes as your brain expects it to. If there's a lag, you get sick. So you need to have 120 frames per second. That's a massive amount of bandwidth. So, and it requires a lot of processing power to make that happen. So that's one constraint. But I think even then, when I think of how we consume content, what we really enjoy is communal experiences. So the demand for live entertainment. So you can, imagine the last concert that you went to, or the last comedy show that you went to. A lot of the value is in the communal experience. With virtuality, you don't have that. And I think of, sometimes going to watch a sporting event, like, going to see like the Olympic Games. And I find, watching some of the sports is definitely exciting, but some of the track and field, like javelin, all you're doing is watching somebody throw a stick from one end of the stadium to another. And on its own, I don't really see the point of it. But when you're watching with lots of other people who are getting excited, and you get excited along with them, with virtuality, you don't have that. So I think there are many fundamental challenges to virtuality in that they don't map onto core human behaviors. Cool. Thank you. Really, really interesting. I see three other questions. let me ask one of them, and then we will respond to the rest at the end. So, Paul, it usually takes some time for a trending technology to convert into a business case and become a part of everyday business. Which of the technologies do you think will be first to become a practical and massive tool for business and consumers, and where?
So out of all the predictions that we have, I just wonder if this is one which is worth looking at for after the next session, because in the next part we've got a lot more of the technologies which are there. So perhaps we could take it then.
Okay, cool. Then let's probably continue with the presentation and switch to Q&A later.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'll just share my screen again, and thank you all for the questions that we've had so far. So the next topic is looking at one of the COVID driven experiences, which is around doctors' visits and the use of video. And so this prediction over here is perhaps a little bit on the ambitious side, but it's sometimes good to be ambitious. And what we're forecasting is that in 2021, up to 5% of all patient visits worldwide may be done via video calls. So this is quite a significant change from 2019, when we think it was less than 1%. And this will probably be applicable to developed markets, because the cost of being able to do a video call is quite high. And just to stress, so when we refer to a video doctor's visits, this is whereby there is a video element, one or both ways. So the doctor being able to see the patient and the patient being able to see the doctor, or both. So this is what we're expecting for 2021. And some data points that we've seen from around the world, and these are selective data points. So what we saw in France is a big rise in video consultation, up to 100,000 consultations per day. So that's a massive increase. And we think some of that increase will be sustained. In the UK, where there are normally 300 million doctors' visits every year, so GP visits, then a lot of the practices, so the GP centres where you go for basic medical attention, about 90% of them have been equipped for online or video consultations. But a lot of them would be online. And one change that's happened in the UK is that whenever you approach a doctor, for those who can do, the first point of interaction is an online question. So what's also called online triage, whereby the questions or the answers that you provide to the questions determine how your case is routed. And in some cases, you don't need to speak to anybody at all. So it's entirely handled by a basic form of artificial intelligence. And in some surveys, and surveys don't necessarily indicate what is actually going to happen, but it may just reflect a point of view at a time, then 14% of Canadians said they would choose a video doctor's visit where possible going forward. Now, one thing which I would just mention, just as a reality check. So in the UK, pre-COVID, 80% of GP appointments were done face-to-face. In November 2020, 45% of consultations were done remotely. So in that month, there was no lockdown. The month after there was, the month before there was a lockdown. So November was 1 month when people could go readily to go and see doctors. But it's worth noting that 99% of those remote consultations were phone calls, and 1% was video. And one point I would just make around doctors' visits and the use of video is, there are a lot of people who've got video capability in most markets, often via smartphones, and access to good technology, good networks. They tend to be the people who don't go and see doctors because they're fine, particularly for men who've obviously got different physiological conditions to women. They may go decades without seeing a doctor. And they're the ones who are often signed up for video visits because they'll never use them. Older age groups are those least likely to have good video setups at home. So they're the ones who may want to go and see a doctor more. And one of the other factors around video calls, so at the moment you can see everything from my shoulders and up, but you can't see the rest of my body. And what a lot of doctors rely on is how people walk into a meeting and a doctor's room, because that provides lots of information on how they actually are. So the next topic is looking at something called intelligent edge. And this is a blend of many technologies that have been evolving over the course of the last few decades. So let me define that. So what intelligent edge represents is a combination of localized computing power, which is a function of growing processor capability at the edge. And so at the edge will be within devices, which might be smartphones, but they might be automated robots. Also, it's the combination of that with sort of greater computing power in general, and also much better connectivity. And we thought that market will be worth $12 billion in 2021. So this over here is just breaking out the three major components. So one of the elements of intelligent edge is very high-speed connectivity, which includes the latest generation wireless connectivity. So it may include 5G, later versions of 4G, and also the latest standard of Wi-Fi, which is called Wi-Fi 6. And one of the benefits of this latest generation technology is the ability to connect far more objects. So I think in terms of connecting people, that job is largely done. But in terms of connecting objects, there is a lot more, much further to go. And almost any object which is man-made can generate useful data. So it may be connecting, for example, like even like a printer. So a business model is to have monthly subscriptions to ink. And as part of that, the printer will communicate when the ink is about to run out. Now, if you look at an industrial context, you could have lots of machines with many sensors which are indicating their status. And it's not just small bits of data like status, but also rich data like camera feeds. And the camera feeds can be sent over high-speed connections and processed locally by more and more powerful edge chips. So using artificial intelligence techniques like machine vision to process that data. I just want to give you some examples of how that may work. And I just want to show an example which I've showed previously around how the intelligent edge could be applied. So what this is over here is an aerial photo of part of Rotterdam, which is one of the largest ports in the world in the Netherlands. And there is an enormous refinery which is adjacent to a residential district. So there is significant risk in having the refinery next to the residential area. And so the real objective is to ensure that nothing goes wrong, nothing leaks. Otherwise, the consequences would be catastrophic. So what has been happening historically within this area is manual inspection of all the pipelines and of the containers. And what they're moving to is the use of 4K cameras, so high resolution, which scan the outsides of the pipelines, and they analyze the video locally, which is sent to an edge computing device over 5G, and then the edge computing device looks for any gaps or breaks or signs of imminent breakage and identifies them, and then that generates a job for engineers to go and look at. So if you look at the flow of data, you've got 4K going over 5G and then being processed, in this case, over Microsoft Azure Cloud. Machine vision detects potential images, potential issues. If there are issues, then that generates a job code, which is then assigned to an engineer. Now, the benefit of Intelligent Edge is that the entire application stays local. So the data is processed faster. You don't need to have connectivity back to a remote data center. So that's the benefit of that approach there. This over here is another example of what could be done, which is facial recognition being applied to pigs to identify pigs who are not well, or who may be sick and contagious. And the benefit of this approach is that humans can't distinguish between 100 different pigs, can't really see their state of distress or happiness or whatever. But a machine can be tuned or trained very readily to do that. So there are definitely agricultural applications of this. The next topic is also staying around data and looking at the growth in cloud. And what's been happening over the last few decades is that cloud has gone from being a brand new service, which a lot of corporates were nervous about, to experiencing treble-digit growth, to slowing down, and then as of last year, re-accelerating. So what we've seen is a move to 30% growth, which is way higher than the average for overall IT. And the expected spend on cloud is expected to be $160 billion this year, so that's $35 billion more than 2020. And you can see the benefits trickling down to the supply chain. So in terms of chip vendors like NVIDIA supplying data centers, their revenues are expected to go up by 5 billion to 40 billion this year. So they're major markets just in terms of addressing data. And one of the fascinating aspects of data centers is the fact that they have become far more ubiquitous, far more prevalent, handling far more processing requests for a lot more companies, but their power consumption has stayed largely constant. And there are many reasons how that's been delivered, but the key thing which I think is really fascinating is that the power consumption has become more and more efficient over the last 10 years and may continue to do so with new techniques like putting data centers underwater to benefit from the cooling effect of the ocean floor. Don't know if it will be good for sea temperatures, but that's certainly one approach that's been applied there. And the implication of this, though, is that when a company, a potential customer, is considering migrating to the cloud, there's a benefit of flexibility, there's a benefit of accessing extra applications, there's a benefit of lower cost, but there's also the benefit of accessing much lower emissions, because it's very unlikely that any private enterprise would have a more efficient private data center than a public data center. And as companies focus more and more on decarbonization, that becomes a bigger and bigger issue. And one of the other factors around data centers, which I think is really interesting, is how some of the major investors in cloud and data centers are also some of the major investors in renewable energy. So lots of the big tech firms have major pledges to reduce their carbon footprint or to have it neutral or negative. And so they are funding the generation of additional renewable power in order to be able to provide power for their data centers. So the last topic I want to talk about is looking at the mobile network. And what we're looking at over here is a shift in the way in which mobile networks are sold. So it's a move from proprietary closed radio access networks to open and also virtualized radio access networks. So just to explain what the radio access network is, it's a combination of the radio unit, which is the antennas and the computer equipment which are attached to them. So that's the DUs. And then the centralized unit, which coordinates multiple base stations. Now, at the moment, almost all operators buy the entirety of the RAM as a closed, almost sealed unit from one of up to 5 vendors. And what we're going to move to is the opening up of the radio access network. So this is something which is being led by the tier 1 operators, so the largest ones like Vodafone, Telefonica, Orange, Deutsche Telekom are some of the leading players in terms of committing to deploy this. And then there are also a few greenfield operators which are also deploying Open RAN. And the benefit of Open RAN, so initially could be lower cost, access to more suppliers, but another benefit is also an easier path to virtualization of some of the features, and so an easier way of upgrading that capability. Now, in terms of the drivers for this, so obviously cost is one of the major factors. Another driver is the availability of more suppliers, still relatively few at the moment. But this is something which some governments are trying to do to reduce reliance on certain countries for the availability of telecoms equipment. There's also a growing number of greenfield operators which are emerging. So there's a few emerging in Europe which have no legacy equipment, no legacy culture, and they're more likely to look at new vendors which are out there. In some markets like the UK, you've got some suppliers which have been prohibited. So that requires the telcos to use different vendors. And Open RAN is an equivalent of an additional vendor, but also is one of the levers to keep the existing European vendors competitive in terms of price. And the last point I mentioned is around towers companies pivoting. So what we've seen over the course of this year is a growth in the number of operators, most recently Vodafone, placing their towers assets into a separate company. The most advanced company which is looking at Open RAN at the moment is a company called Rakuten. And I just want to mention a few of its characteristics because they're quite unusual. So Rakuten unusually is acting as a buyer of lots of different types of equipment. So it's acting as a systems integrator. As a mobile operator, its ambition is to be able to offer customers 30 gigabytes per day. Now, 30 gigabytes compares to about 4 or 5 gigabytes per month in somewhere like Germany or the UK. So this is massively greater than what you have right now. But also Rakuten is acting as a vendor. So it's bundling up all its knowledge and offering that to other operators, the most significant of which is Telefonica, which is a partner to Rakuten in the rollout of its network in the future. Okay, so that was the last comment I wanted to make around the second part of the predictions. And so I will hand back now to Vladimir.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. really interesting and exciting, especially about this change of our lives and technology making feasible living people close to something that was considered to be dangerous some time ago and still considered to be dangerous. Coming back to questions that we have here. So there was a question that we decided to defer regarding time lag between trending technology converting into a business case and becoming a part of our everyday business. So the question was, which of the technologies do you think will be the first to become a practical and massive tool for businesses and consumers, and where?
Yeah, so what I'd expect around there is, so intelligent edge is a combination of multiple technologies. But, what's core to intelligent edge is automation and also the generation of more data. So with intelligent edge, I think one of the massive applications is just around infrastructure and maintenance of infrastructure. So if you think about, one of the big focuses is generating more and more renewable energy, such as wind. And wind turbines are massive structures which are deliberately placed to face the full brunt of nature. So they're going to go under a lot of stress. So they need to be monitored regularly. And so one of the applications for intelligent edge is to have drones positioned on a wind turbine, so powered by a wind turbine. And what they would do is, on a regular basis, go out and do a visual inspection of the wind turbine and send the video to a local edge computer within the turbine, which would analyze the images and look for cracks. And the wind turbine would have a private network to enable the video footage to be streamed to the turbine and to the edge computer there. And then any anomalies which are detected could then trigger a maintenance visit by an individual. So if you compare that to the requirement to have a human stop the wind turbine and analyze and do a visual inspection, that's far more disruptive and far more expensive. And you could also apply that kind of visual inspection approach to any railway line, to any motorway, to any bridge, to the outside of buildings. And so you've got multiple emerging technologies, better connectivity, better machine vision, better drones, better cameras, all working in tandem together. And so I think those applications are very powerful because there is a very obvious ROI. And some of the technology, a lot of the technologies are becoming quite mature, like drones, which were really new 2014, but they are becoming more established, more understood, less feared.
Great, thanks. There is one more question coming from Anastasia about the impact of the technologies in our lives. And impact actually varies from very direct impact that change the way we consume, we use things, what we feel, and so on. There are things that change how we spend our time. I remember that on one of the predictions, you mentioned one OTT providers that didn't reach its plans because some other OTT providers launched something. And people simply switch from watching TV shows to doing something. What are the technologies that might change our approach to time spending?
Yeah, so if you look at the technologies which succeed tend to have, as a feature, great ease of use. And one of the big shifts which is happening at the moment, which is affecting how we spend our leisure time, is a move from broadcast TV to video on demand. Something which is well known. But I think one of the really fascinating elements of that is, all the different shifts which are happening as a result of that. And so if I go back 10 years, when you think of a television, it was largely a dumb panel that you would attach to a set-top box, or which would have a simple receiver in it to show television signal, but you wouldn't need very much computing power. Now, the way in which I see a television, it's effectively a smartphone processor and a smartphone operating system attached to a very large screen, but with far more intelligence than last year, and far less than what you'll have next year. And so the scope of what you can do as a TV set vendor is really different. And there are some television set vendors, for example, like Vizio in the US, and they sell advertising on their TV sets. So they're disintermediating traditional sales channels because they've got that control there. And there are also some television set vendors which are saying, okay, if we're going to provide prominence or promote a ad-funded channel, we want 30% of the revenues, of the ad revenues. So that's something which is really different. And I think for consumers, the benefit they get is access to more content. They get greater ease of use. But the sort of growing intelligence of TV sets shifts the power, and we're just at the start of that right now.
Great, thanks. And actually, you mentioned about consuming video content online and via broadband networks. How do you think 5G networks can transform the future of TV video content broadcasting?
I think it's really hard, actually. So I used to think that this would be quite a major market. But so with 5G, the cost per gigabyte carried falls a lot. So you might get down to about 5 cents per gigabyte carried. Now, if you've got a household which is carrying 200 gigabytes per month, which is, quite a normal download quantity when people are watching live TV and topping up with video on demand and watching in HD, then the wholesale cost of carrying that would be $10, and you could charge $20, and people would be happy in quite a few markets. What the migration to 4K does is it increases the gigabyte count really significantly. So with HD, you need about 3 megabits per second for drama. With 4K, it's between 15 and 25. So it's way higher. And then when you move to 8K, it'll probably be like 20 to 40. And if you're watching live content, it will be 50 megabits per second. So rather than it being 200 gigabytes, it's going to be a terabyte. Or 2 terabytes. So if you've got 2 terabytes at 5 cents, that's $100 wholesale. So you probably want to be charging $200 per month. And in almost every market apart from the US, that's too expensive. So 5G can be used, but for households which have relatively low bandwidth needs, and that would be a minority of the market. So it is a solution, and it's one which is being pushed by companies like Verizon in the US. It's available in quite a few markets, but I don't think it will be mainstream, because a mainstream consumer will be downloading, let's say in Western Europe, 1 terabyte per month by 2025. Central Europe, it might be 27, 28, so there'll be a lag there, but by the end of the decade, a terabyte a month in Europe will be the average.
Cool. Thanks. Actually, talking about the volumes of data and 5G in particular, we see this everyday increase in consumption and data flowing through the air. What could you say about people that believe that, say, C19 and some other things influencing their health negatively are actually caused by this additional data about 5G, Wi-Fi 6. I have a friend of mine who said that he will never have Wi-Fi 6 at home because it's too dangerous. And like, I have it. I'm still alive for a couple of months already. Hope it will continue. But what's your view?
I don't think there's any risk from 5G, 4G, Wi-Fi 6, any other form of Wi-Fi, and the other wireless technologies which are out there. You make a point about Wi-Fi 6, you having that for 2 months, and it hasn't really affected you. And if we think about all the mainstream services which use radio waves to work, so they include TV, they include radio, they include regular Wi-Fi. We've coexisted with radio for 100 years, with TV for 70 years, with Wi-Fi, I would say between 10 and 20 years, depending on the market. And we're all fine. And we've also coexisted with mobile phones since 1980, with 2G since 1990, with 3G since 2000, 4G since 2010. And one of the trends that we see with cellular mobile is with every generation of mobile, you have a move to more base stations. And more base stations means that you need less power to go from the base station to the person and from the person to the base station. So the base stations emit less power and the phones emit less power. So I think where people get scared is like mobile networks are like magic, so how is it we can send 4K video through the air invisibly? It is a wonderful achievement. And unless you've done physics, it's really hard to understand how it works. But it's the same kind of principle as a walkie-talkie, that you're using energy to convey information, and you've got transceivers. And with TV, the antennae might be using 100,000 watts. With 5G, the maximum is 200 watts from a base station. For a picocell, it's 0.1 of a watt. That's why you're not being affected. So if you're using a Wi-Fi 6 base station, it requires very, very little power because you're so close to the base station. And so radio waves, when you've got massive power, can hurt you, but this is tiny amounts of power. So there's no link with COVID-19. And I've also seen that COVID-19 has been or 5G has been accused of being solely there to spread COVID-19 infection through the base stations. And that's just impossible. But I can fully understand when people are scared and looking for explanations, then it's very easy to believe in myths. And people have done that for millennia. But there is no risk.
Yeah. I remember there are a lot of similar things were happening during centuries, destroying new plants and other things. But anyway, probably last question about 5G. In some countries, 5G has been already adopted. For example, in Switzerland and some other. What benefits it created for end customers? First in B2C for people and B2B for enterprises, comparing to 4G. Can you name those?
Sure. So for consumers, one of the big benefits of 5G is all about the additional capacity. So the ability to support a lot more users in a confined space. So in a place like a music festival where you might have 100,000 people all really packed together, then what 5G enables is everybody to be there and then streaming video in a decent resolution to their friends to make them jealous, because that's the application, is envy. And then say if you're at a airport and again it was very packed, then 5G is great. Shopping centers, train stations, parks in the summer. But of course we haven't had that, so we've had to stay away from each other, and social distancing kind of defeats the benefit of 5G, but temporarily. So in terms of what are the benefits to consumers, they're pretty small at the moment, but we're living in unusual times. My expectation is that as soon as we go back to being able to be with each other and close to each other and being packed together like sardines and paying €100 for the privilege, then that's when the benefits of 5G will come through. And people who've got 5G in areas of coverage and are able to send that clip will feel good about themselves. Which was the same case with 4G versus 3G, or 4G with one network versus another network. We like to compete with other individuals. So I expect that will certainly apply then. In terms of enterprise, so one of the big benefits of 5G for enterprise is the ability to connect far more things wirelessly rather than in a wired fashion. And there are certainly some applications which are coming on stream now, so in the last few months. So, for example, Mercedes opened a factory which has a 5G capability as well as Wi-Fi 6 within there. And the applications include the ability for automated guided vehicles to move around the factory. And 5G enables some of the location positioning of those carts. But even, so some of the projects which are being planned are, say, like for operating theatres and hospitals, which are full of cables and which ideally require really high resolution images to be able to see scans of organs, and having like the ability to send that information through to a tablet rather than to a monitor, which is in one part of the room, just makes the whole process easier. And there are lots of applications where the simple application is really high-speed connectivity in bursts, and that's the application. But I think those will take a few years to fully manifest. So we need to get COVID out of the way first.
Yeah, let's hope so. I have a question regarding actually development of the technology. Mm-hmm. In the previous times, technologies were often driven by military needs, by army needs, and by wars. Unfortunately, this was one of the key drivers for people to move forward. Today, innovations could be driven by some other things, hopefully. Maybe change of climate, a need to compensate what we created as a humanity, maybe getting new experience, other things. What's your view? What's now the key driver of the technology? Someone rumors that it could be still army, but we simply don't see it.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the technologies generated by military applications, I mean, but there are, cellular mobile is one of those, which was created by, for military use initially. The internet was a way of dealing with distributed communication in the instance of like catastrophic bombing. So there are lots of foundations which have been created by the military which continue to be useful right now. If I look at what the current motivations are, one of them is just basically the desire to make money, so and the there are companies, for example, which focus on making money move faster, so payments processing and taking a small commission off that is a great way to make money because you take a small tax off every transaction is extremely valuable. And just making information move without intervention is a great tool, because it improves operational efficiency. So straightforward profit is a massive driver, and it's profit driven by operational efficiency. Linked to that, so if we cast ourselves forward, let's say to 2030, then it's probable that there will be a lot more carbon taxes. And so a lot of innovation will be driven to reduce the levels of carbon taxation. That's very, very likely. So I would expect over the next 5 years, lots more penalties driven or linked to emissions. and the desire to avoid those penalties will drive that. So one of the fascinating areas is around renewable power, and hydro has been really big for a long time, and I expect there'll be lots of developments still in that space. Another one is solar, which has been growing fast, and there is at the moment, I think, like the average efficiency of a solar panel is about 20%, so 80% is wasted. So if you can move efficiency from 20 to 30% of some solar power turned into electricity, then that's a massive, massive benefit. So it's 50% more from the existing solar panels which are out there. And if you are the company which has got the patent to move from 20 to 30, that's really, really valuable. And it becomes more valuable according to the volume of carbon taxation as well. And then linked to that will be, so the grid is inefficient. So historically, we had power grids which are based on, say, large coal-powered power stations, or from any other source, and then the electricity would be driven to, or would flow to the point of need, but it might be 100, 200 kilometers away, and you lose power along the way in the journey. Now, if you can start creating a lot more batteries, then you have a lot more local power storage, a lot less power which is lost, and more efficient use of all the power that's generated. And so things like solar plus batteries, or even just a reuse of electric vehicle batteries, becomes really interesting. So there's lots and lots of models which are out there. So, I would definitely expect carbon to be there, but also just trying to do things more cheaply and disrupting is another major driver of innovation.
Cool. And actually, to continue a discussion about trends and drivers for changes, for people here, for business audience in general, experts, managers, business owners, everyone seems to want to be at the age of emerging technology, lead new products to the market, provide new solutions within our company. Can you share some secrets of what should one do, which quality should gain in order to become game changer himself?
So, in terms of becoming a game changer, I was reading just recently about, so there's one company which just goes around looking at wherever fax machines are still being used. So you think how old the fax machine is and how slow it is. And they go around looking for parts of the world, including, sort of like developed countries, where there just hasn't been straightforward automation of processes. Very often moving from sort of person-managed booking or ordering to self-service is a massive saving. So if you think of sort of the most powerful companies which exist right now, a lot of their benefit is based on the fact that they offer really good self-service tools. I mean, like the Zoom call, so Zoom, a lot of the ordering for Zoom is just self-service. So you think of the savings that's made on Salesforce. It can be, for some tech companies, it used to be like half of your costs are in terms of hiring salespeople and incentivizing them. So that's a massive benefit there. And looking for those opportunities, I think is still a really important thing to do. So there are tons of emerging technologies. All of them have a massive degree of risk around them. But just finding those opportunities where there hasn't been very much automation taking place. Lots of the smaller companies like SMEs are still very analog. Digital transformation tends to be amongst the largest corporates, which have dedicated teams to do that, and then about 10% of small companies. So, one thing that I would look at is look for the areas where digital transformation hasn't happened, and there are lots of them.
Actually, you mentioned a couple of things right now that are changing our lives helps companies save money. And in parallel, for some people, unfortunately, losing their jobs. But fortunately, forcing people finding something new for them, to start doing something new, learning something new. And we can discuss for quite a lot what should be the profession of the future, what will be the key profession that will be required by the market and business. But in your opinion, which top 3 professions will be demanded in the future for the TMT sector in particular? If we narrow down this discussion to TMT sector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I look at the next few years, so one major round of automation is going to be around machine vision, because you've got a lot of elements which enable that. So you've got better cameras, better machine vision, better connectivity to enable the images to flow. And there are lots of tasks which require visual inspection. And automating that is a great thing to do. So one of the professions which will certainly be around for a long time is just applying that kind of technology to existing problems. So providing a further degree of automation. I think there will also be a massive role for cybersecurity. So the more that we move to digital, the more strategic it will become to have really resilient cybersecurity. And you probably will have read of attacks on some elements of the US. What's always going to be the case is that for many companies, security will be regarded as an additional cost, so probably won't be that applied. And so a lot of companies will be playing catch up with cyber. And then another really important element with technology is to make the mass market like it, you've got to make it look good. You've got to make it easy to use. And so ergonomics and user interface design is always going to be really important.
Cool. I have 2 questions left, one from the audience and one from me. First question is from Igor. What are the top 3 trends in technology that will influence media sector in the next 5 years? What's your view?
That's a good question. So the biggest part of the media sector is television. And there are 2 major sources of revenue there. So there is pay, and then there is also advertising. So around that, one thing that we expect to see is, so we've been used to the idea of more and more video on demand services emerging. And, a lot of households are happy to have 1, 2, 3, 4 services. And when you get to 5 or 6, then that's a point where you start seeing churn. So one trend that we expect to see in Europe next year and the year after that will be a massive surge in churn for video on demand services. And a lot of media companies need to get ready for that. But companies like telcos are well positioned to help manage churn. So that's one of those elements there. Also, in terms of media and television, there is going to be probably an attempt to move to more targeted advertising and more tracking, to be able to follow the journey as people see perhaps an advert on a large screen on TV, and then they migrate to, say, using a smartphone, and then tracking that journey would enable TV to get more recognition for the behaviors that it influences. And then the other big topic around media, which often gets overlooked, is video games. It's just an enormous market. And there are lots and lots of developments which are out there. The topic I'm looking at, which I don't really understand at the moment, is non-fungible tokens. So that's using crypto to make content unique. So going from commoditized to unique. And what we'd expect is in 2022 for there to be over $1 billion in sales of sports content, so often video, which is made collectible via cryptography. So those are three.
Great. We'll see how it develops. I especially like the element of video gaming. We'll see. And the last question for me, Ukraine is a development country. And we try to find the way to find our place in the global map. You've been here a couple of times. I hope you saw the developments that are happening. We have quite a few startups coming out from Ukraine, covering various sectors of the technologies, supporting businesses. Some of those worth hundreds of millions already. But still, we are in a search, trying to find our place and trying to find area where we should focus on. And the question now, what do you think is the main development potential for the country like ours, and what should be a focus for us on VW?
So that's a really good question. And one of the things around what to focus on is, and it's really important to be pragmatic and realistic as to what is possible. I mean, I often get this question asked about the UK, and why doesn't the UK make its own semiconductors? And it's because it doesn't have any capability in doing that. It would require probably $100 billion in capex, and it would take 10 years. And even then, it may not work. So you need to focus on whatever is within your capability to be really specialist in. And then another factor is you need to come up with lots of ideas, the majority of which are going to fail, and then try and scale them. Now, scaling them within Ukraine, because of the size of the country and the size of the market, is going to be hard to do. So you kind of need partner countries which are larger with which to work with, to so that you generate the ideas, and perhaps you use another market in which to test out their commercial applicability. One thing I remember from one of the visits I had, we were talking about augmented reality filters and about the ability to create these via developers in the Ukraine, so that they are really small, so very, very tiny file sizes. And even though we've got more and more connectivity, the ability to create tiny applications, which could be a face filter, which have very little, so which are very small but very effective, is always going to be a benefit. And when I think of so like video calling, there are lots and lots of apps which are out there. The ones which are most successful are the ones which are lightest on processing power and on bandwidth, because they are least likely to fail, because bandwidth is always going to be fluctuating because it's often on the best efforts basis. And so, we've talked about the fact that it was only recently that Ukraine went 4G, but it's useful to turn that into an advantage, because what that obliges is the creation of content which looks great but is a small file size, and that kind of benefit is going to be useful absolutely everywhere. So I would definitely say take sort of apply the advantages that you have, but also find countries to partner with.
By finding countries to partner, is it for finding the markets for the products and testing our products, like Israel, for example, with the US, or what do you mean?
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about Israel and the US beforehand, so it's quite a small country, but it has lots of tech innovation coming out of there. And so, there is a flow of ideas, funding, which is very important, and also expertise, so counseling on how to grow the market. And think of something like Waze, that's something that was kind of nurtured in Israel, but obviously has massive applicability in lots of markets. I mean, it's an application that a lot of taxi drivers use in London. But that kind of service is something which can grow with lots of, can grow fastest with financial support, but also advice and also contacts, and then ultimately avenues for an exit.
Cool. Thanks, Paul. I hope that next time you come to Ukraine, probably next year, and fingers crossed, we might have an event in life, in reality. You will see some changes here. But we are coming to the end of our event. I want to express my gratitude, Paul, to you and all the audience for staying with us. And hope you have received today some useful insights that you potentially might use in practice and actually use in your businesses. And I invite you to listen to our podcasts, Deloitte TMT Talks series about trends of the technology market of Ukraine with the headliners of the industry on Deloitte SoundCloud, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. All references are already stated in our comments. And one more thing, I invite you all to the second part of our presentation, where we are going to hold a discussion with the headliners of the domestic business about relevance of the predictions and possible scenarios of their implementation in Ukraine. Probably we will talk about what we might be good at in Ukraine to find our place, as we just discussed. Soon we are going to announce a date of the event and the speakers, and we will send you the invitations via emails that you have mentioned during the registration. So thanks everyone for listening. Paul, thank you very much. As always,
pleasure.
Great presentation.
Thank you very much for having me, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.